My name is Todd Sedgwick. I want to welcome everybody to, it's a great pleasure and privilege for me to introduce my good friend, Ambassador A.B. Culvahouse. And A.B. was formerly chair of Melvin & Myers, international law firm with over 1,000 lawyers. And he's had a very extensive career in and out of government, starting with being legislative aide to Senator Howard Baker. And then when Baker became chief of staff to President Reagan, he insisted that A.B. come along with him to become White House counsel for President Reagan. And there he worked on some of the legal aspects of some of the nuclear agreements. And he's had wide experience in both the nuclear issues and in intelligence issues. He was on the, he served as a member of the Federal Advisory Committee on Nuclear Failsafe and Risk Reduction, which recommended improvements in the nuclear command and control system, and also served on the Counterintelligence Advisory Panel to the U.S. Select Committee on Intelligence. He was a trustee of Brookings. He helped both candidate McCain and Trump vet their candidates. We don't want to grill them too much about that this afternoon. But A.B., it's a real pleasure to have you join us today. I really appreciate you taking the time. And the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Sedgwick. Always good to be with you, my friend. And I appreciate the council and others receiving me. It's an honor to be here. And just let me say, because I might forget to say otherwise, it was a particular and peculiar honor to be United States Ambassador to the Commonwealth of Australia. Howard Baker, my first employer out of law school, used to say that public service was the highest calling. And it was a rare privilege to represent our great country in Australia. Let me just do a brief history of how I came to be ambassador. I was sitting in my office in August of 2018, and I get a call from Vice President Pence, whom I've known from the vice presidential selection process, with my friend Lamar Alexander, and with Jared Kushner on the line, and I knew that I was about to have my arm twisted. And basically the issue was that we needed an ambassador to Australia. My predecessor, John Barry, had left in August 2016. Harry Harris was slated to go over there. Harry, who spoke to this group not too many weeks ago, but Harry being the Indo-PACOM commander and with Kim Jong-un raising issues and making threats in the Korean Peninsula, Harry had been diverted to Seoul, and we needed an ambassador to Australia. I quickly went to Canberra. I'd never been. It was a little bit of a setup. I didn't meet with the government, did not meet with the embassy, but met with some people that had been recommended by mutual friends. And what really struck me was the Australian appreciation for the United States, the Battle of the Coral Sea, which we think of as a tie, and many of us don't know that much about. They view as the naval battle that saved Australia. It's a country that has great reverence for its war dead. The Australian War Memorial is just one of the most impressive places. It's equally as impressive as Arlington. And there are more Australians can tell you than I think Americans can Australia, notwithstanding the fact there's only 25 million of them and there's 330 million of us, that more than 50,000 American war dead in World War II in the Pacific, bodies were never recovered. They know that much about the United States and think that we essentially saved their bacon. So it was a great honor to go there. I was, because Corker was a friend and was chair of the committee, my confirmation went pretty smoothly. Once we got the diplomatic security to do their background work, even though I had all of these clearances that Todd just described, they had to start over. The CIA clearances, DOD clearances, White House clearances were not good enough, which was a little frustrating. I suspect all of you have seen that as well. But I was confirmed on the last Senate day, January 2nd, 2019, but I was out of sequence. There was no ambassador school that I could go to. So they said, well, you can't go until you go to ambassador school. This is State Department. And then because of a government shutdown, ambassador school was canceled. And then so they were doing, the State Department decided, well, we'll do a bespoke ambassador school. So I was rushing all over the government, meeting with every deputy secretary and assistant secretary, trying to get the equivalent of what you would get in ambassador school. And then finally, the foreign minister, whom I'd met in a sidebar, called me up and said, Culvahouse, if you're going to do your job, you got to get over here, because we're Parliament's about to be dissolved. We're about to have an election, and you've got to get to meet the front bench of both parties. So I arrived in March of 2019, presented my credentials, and then did a forced march through the front bench of both the coalition, that's the coalition of the Liberal Party and the National Party, headed by Scott Morrison, and then the Labour Party, then headed by Bill Shorten. It was everyone in Australia, except Scott Morrison, believed that Morrison was going to lose and that Shorten was going to win. Everyone at the embassy thought that Morrison was going to lose. And but we were fastidious in trying to be equal. But I'll never forget when I met with the Prime Minister at the end of the meeting, he asked my handlers from the embassy to leave, and he looked at me and he says, "Your guys are telling you that I'm going to lose, right?" And that was a moment where I decided to be candid. I said, "Prime Minister, yes." He said, "Most of my handlers think I'm going to lose, but I'm going to win, and I'll show you how." And he walked through his narrow path to victory, and we reported that back. The one thing that I did do well, and it was by happenstance, because of the resentment of the 3-year delay, essentially almost 3-year delay, me showing up, which many Australians took offense at. I announced at my first press conference, just after I presented my credentials, that I was going to visit all 6 states and the Northern Territory in the first 100 days. That's a whole lot easier to say than do. For us Americans, it's only 6 states, but Australia is geographically essentially as large as the lower 48. And when you go to a state capital, there's a real rigid protocol. It's about 3 to 4 days, 3.5 days of things you must do. You must see the premier. You must see the governor who represents Her Majesty. There's a couple or 3 universities, a couple of press outlets, and then there's usually an American military or intelligence presence or 2. But it turned out, even though it was an arduous exercise, 2020 was a year where you couldn't travel because of bushfires and then COVID. So I had really done a lot of traveling in 2019, and that served us well. Australia sits at the front lines of the great competition of our time, geographically, militarily, intelligence-wise, and they're in a interesting place. We are, and when I arrived in 2019, and they will say that we are their strategic alliances with the United States, their security and intelligence alliances with the United States, but China by far, then and to this day, is their largest trading partner. Their trading partner, not economic partner, trading partner, from iron ore to stoking coal, LNG, a lot of agricultural products, as well as tourism, not anymore because of COVID, and education. So about 45% of trade for Australia is with the People's Republic of China. So that they were quite adamant about trying to tiptoe through that minefield, so to speak. and take care of their economic interests while being very realistic about their economic interests. The PRC presence in Australia when I arrived in 2019 was large, and it was coercive. It's even more coercive today, but they had 5 consulates. We had 3. They probably had twice as many diplomats as we did, and a lot of undeclared representatives, and 150,000 Chinese students, probably 50,000 of whom were from the PLA. So it was quite stunning when you calculate how much Australia had been invaded, so to speak, by Chinese in a soft power way. Australia, in addition, is Alan Glengell, who is a former intelligence officer, wrote a book called The Fear of Abandonment. And I believe it's true. Australia, from dating back to World War I, where they felt that the British used them as cannon fodder in Europe, and World War II, where after the fall of Singapore, the British were pulling their troops out of the Pacific. There is a fear of abandonment in their DNA. I've sometimes said, and I've said this out loud, they're a little bit like, I'm an older sibling, I'm the eldest, but they're like a younger sibling. You can't tell them you love them enough. You can't, and that is something that we have neglected somewhat. Their diplomatic corps is small, comparatively speaking. And their standard defense, standard introduction to anything is, well, Australia is a middle power, and as a middle power, we cannot aspire to a great power role, which I think undersells Australia. Australia has immense capacity for leadership in the region. Many other countries, particularly the Pacific Island countries, but also Japan, India, Indonesia, look to Australia for leadership, and there's even more capacity for leadership there. We also at the embassy used to talk about Australia as diplomats and some of their cabinet officers using a country agnostic formulation. They would talk about the malign activities of unnamed powers in the region. They would complain about the concerns of unnamed powers' lack of respect for sovereignty, but they would never use the PRC word. They would never say the People's Republic of China. So it was, that kind of captured where we were in 2019. We had 3 priorities. Those of you, a couple of you on the phone know Howard Baker, but Howard used to say, if you have more than 3 priorities, you have none. And I'm of that same school. And our first priority was to leave the alliance stronger than we found it. And what we felt we needed to do was communications discipline, to talk about the United States commitment to Australia to be solemn, be profound, and to a term that Secretary Pompeo used when he gave a speech in Sydney in August of 2019, unbreakable, the unbreakable alliance. And that sounds a bit trite, but Mark Grossman, the great undersecretary, when I ultimately did go to ambassador school, said that communications discipline is so important in what we do. And I agree with that. And we would just repeat that we're a Pacific nation, we're a treaty ally, our commitments to Australia are solemn, profound, and unbreakable. Also, I learned pretty quickly to praise what Australia is doing. We always had a great long list of asks. Every time I would see the foreign minister, the defense minister, the intelligence officials, the prime minister, but you had to be both publicly with the press and in privately praise them for the leadership they were showing in pushing Huawei out of the 5G networks, their foreign investment regime, which was essentially reviewed all foreign investments, whether U.S., Chinese, Canadian, what have you, Japanese, but that meant they reviewed all PRC investments. And other than the Port of Darwin, which was before this regime, was back in 2015, I can't say that there were any investments in Australia in sensitive sectors that I think has escaped that screen. There was a lot that happened in 2019. We had a Marine Rotational Force Darwin, the largest. We had 2,500 Marines training in the Northern Territory. We had the largest Talisman Sabre exercise, which is a big naval exercise off Brisbane. The Ronald Reagan, my favorite U.S. aircraft carrier, having worked in the Reagan White House, was our flagship there. The embassy staff asked, whether I was going to invite the defense minister to fly out to the Reagan. I said, no, I'm going to ask the prime minister. People said, he won't do it. I called him, he agreed on the phone, and we owned that day. And it was that, I think you just need to, the worst he could say is no, but it was a great day. It was a great day for the alliance. The Australians also during 2019, 2020, and I predict will continue in 2021, we're engaged in a number of joint presence operations in the South China Sea, in task forces with us, with the Japanese and others. And then, of course, we had a state visit. Scott Morrison in September of 2019 was one of two state visits and state dinners in the Reagan administration. It was a great event. And we also conducted some important business on critical minerals, on space cooperation, outer space cooperation, and on frontier technologies. Another thing that was good in 2019, given what happened in 2020 with the bushfires, is we had more congressmen and senators come to Australia in 2019 than any time since World War II. It was quite a burden on the staff, but it was really I think gave us a platform to tell the Australia government and people that that alliance was important. It was something that Americans and the American government, both parties, cared about. Australia during 2019 and 2020 continued to lean in. They obviously led the demand for an inquiry into the origin of the COVID virus, which the PRC government did not like at all. But the World Health Assembly went Australia's way. They joined us in criticizing the treatment of the Uyghurs. They joined us in criticizing what is happening in Hong Kong. They have conducted foreign interference investigations under the statute and have gone after a couple of aides to some parliament members of the state parliament who are effectively thought to be PRC agents. And finally, and this is a very important document, although it's misnamed, it's called this Defense Strategic Update. It's not an update, it's a new policy where they assume that Australia may have to fight a kinetic battle in its northern reaches in the very near future, and contemplate further investments in that regard. Second priority was to deepen economic engagement. The United States already was and is Australia's largest economic partner by far because of foreign direct investment, but no one knew it. We've forgotten that had fallen out of our talking points. And the AmCham, the American Chamber, stepped up and hired Deloitte to do a report. We went on the road and proselytized that. And you could see it took 2 years of disciplined communication, but not only the coalition government and the prime minister, but also a lot of the premiers, including labor opposition leaders, recognize that and are reminding the Australian people that the United States is Australia's largest and most important economic partner. We signed Australia joined the Artemis Accords, which is the U.S. initiative to return a man and to put the first woman on the moon, and then to go on to Mars. And Australia, because of its geographic location, its great expertise in robotics and harsh environments, has a lot to add to that, and they're throwing in a fair amount of money as well. And then frontier technologies, artificial intelligence, laser communications, and all of that is exciting to younger Australians, which is a cohort that we are not reaching and that we need to reach. We're trying to space frontier technologies are particularly interesting to that. And then finally, our third priority was support the Australian step up in the Pacific. Australia, as a matter of policy, has said that they were going to play the leadership role amongst Western nations in the Pacific Islands countries. That's a huge expanse of ocean, 10 countries, but not a great population, 10 million roughly, with Papua New Guinea being the largest member there. There's a real game of whack-a-mole with the PRC government there, and with the BRI initiative and each and every one of those small countries. A lot is going on there. COVID has interrupted it, but the Japanese, Australia, and the United States have created the trilateral infrastructure partnership. They're doing things like electrifying that vast part of Papua New Guinea that has no electricity, undersea cables and whatnot. And there was a lot of USAID and law enforcement cooperation that was on the books and about ready to launch, but COVID interrupted that. Finally, I'll quickly, Todd, talk about 2020. It was biblical. It was, I woke up with all the smoke alarms going off in my residence just after Christmas. And the bushfires, which were at that point 200 miles away, but the smoke had set off all the bushfires for 17 days, I think it was. We had the worst air quality in the world in Canberra, of all places. With housing that was not, did not anticipate that. We had a lot of embassy staff there that could not have received medical clearance to go to Delhi or Beijing, but were found themselves in Canberra in houses that were not airtight, and it was a challenge. We got through that. It was some lessons learned. I think in some respects, some of the protocols and processes that the department back home and the folks in Australia worked out were adapted in COVID. And then finally, then we had with the hard lockdown on the borders and COVID, and it's 2020, well, compared to 2019, I had one visitor, one VIP in 2020, who was the head of SOCOM, who snuck in right after the bushfires just before COVID. And so it was kind of night and day. And now they have floods, so it is biblical indeed. With that, Todd, I think that finally Australia is, if you follow the news, it's Scott Morrison, who was very popular for a while, is less popular now. His defense minister and his attorney general are both taking leaves, in part because of some tawdry conduct that is going on in Parliament. So he is now personally popular, but if the election were held today, all the prognostication is that there might be a change in government. So with that, I'll turn it over for questions.
Well, AB, thank you so much for that very lively behind the scenes account of your tenure. Really appreciate your insights. And I want to encourage everybody to ask questions, use the Q&A tab. Some iPads have it on the top, some on the bottom. So find the Q&A, and we have some good questions in the pipeline already. I just want to also share with my colleagues that the good news that Ambassador Culvahouse has agreed to join our merry band and the council, and we really want to give you a warm welcome to the council. Really appreciate your joining. So we look forward to seeing more of you in the future. I have, oh, by the way, I just want to tell a story about my ambassador school. I went to one, but there's certain elements of it that they didn't have. So I got held up for so long, I went to a second one. And then they said, what happened? Did you flunk out of the first one? So anyways, I'm going to combine two questions here, AB, one from Ambassador Culvahouse. They both have to do with China, and I think they could be answered in the same narrative. China is branching out all over the world, Africa, Europe, South America. What are they up to in Australia? Is the Australian government keeping a wary eye on the South China Seas and the sea lanes? Never mind that they're several thousand miles north. That's from Ambassador Culvahouse, and then from Ambassador Bliss. What advice would the Australian government give the Biden administration on dealing with China?
I'll answer Don Bliss's question. Second, I think it'd be one word, presence. They would like to see more and continued U.S. presence. The Aussies, we used to say, well, we have a greater percentage of our naval ships present in the Indo-Pacific than we ever have. And they said, no, well, what you've done is just reduce the size of your fleet. And so you've reduced the size of the Atlantic fleet, Pacific fleet stayed the same, but you don't have any more ships. You need more ships. But I think they would force posture initiatives is a big issue. They would like to see, whether it's the Marines in Darwin, they would like to see maybe an Army equivalent in Queensland, Coast Guard in Antarctica, and the Pacific Islands, and of course our Navy. So I think presence is all important. The Aussies are under a lot of pressure. The wolf warriors have, whether it's a wine embargo, a barley embargo, they're holding up thermal coal shipments to China, not coking coal. I'm sorry, yeah, but they are holding up thermal coal. The DCM at the PRC embassy in Canberra, who's a real wolf warrior, DCM Wang, called in the press and listed 14 grievances that China had, the PRC had with Australia, including defending the demonstrators in Hong Kong, including supporting an inquiry in the origin of the virus. So there's the Aussies are quite, they think of themselves as very much on the front line of economic coercion. They think of themselves as on the front lines of penetration. They're one of the country agnostic announcements that the Australians made in late 2019 was that both political parties and the parliament's databases had been intruded by a third party. They never said by whom, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out who the logical suspects are. So I think what they need, and what I believe the new administration is doing, based on what I've seen Jake Sullivan and Secretary Blinken say, is constant reassurance, as well as Kurt Campbell, who's now at the NSC, that we'll not abandon them, that they will not be left alone. The U.S. Studies Center, which is partially funded by the United States government, ran a war game while I was there, and I let me say, it was not my. I made my displeasure known, but the end result of the war game was that the United States, and this was. It didn't have to end this way, but the way they gamed it out is that we abandoned Australia and left Australia alone with Indonesia to go head to head against the PRC, and it didn't end well. That's their fear, that they will be left alone, and it's got to be addressed every day.
There's a related question from Ambassador Bliss. What did you think of the Blinken-Sullivan meeting with their Chinese counterparts in Anchorage?
I guess the real, we don't know what happened in the private meeting, but welcome to the welcome Ms. Messrs. Sullivan and Blinken to the world in which those of what Australia has encountered the past 2 years. The wolf warriors are in their ascendancy. They control the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing. The DCM, who was a young and very aggressive wolf warrior, and this, by the way, is a wolf warrior comes from a couple of Chinese movies where wolf warriors are people who it's kind of the Chinese equivalent of our Red Dawn movie, and not I don't know if any of you ever saw the Red Dawn, where some kids, high school kids, saved America from the Russians or from the Soviets. But in any event, we used to say when I got that we would like for the Chinese to get back on side, that our vision of the Indo-Pacific was open and available to everyone who would play by the rules, and that and who would respect sovereignty, and who would not act in a corruptive and corrosive way. And we would like for the PRC to get back on side, but I think the reality is, as long as she is the leader, that this is what we're going to be dealing with, and it's good that it happened quickly. And it's good that each of Blinken, Sullivan, and Campbell have said that we will not abandon Australia. That's what Australia needs to hear.
Great. There are a few questions, Ambassador, about the Quad, which is the quadrilateral security dialogue established back in 2007, involving U.S., Australia, Japan, and India. And can you tell us a little bit about how effective it is? Is it functioning? How well is it functioning, or how well or poorly, as the case may be? And what's the trend line?
Well, the trend line is good. I'll go to the positive first, because of the virtual meeting, leaders meeting that President Biden just had. And it sounds like it went well, and they talked about important things, including COVID vaccine outreach in the region. I'm sure that in the secure part of it, they also talked about malign activities of the great strategic competitor from the north in the region. But when I went through confirmation, almost each member of the Foreign Relations Committee, without exception, really, Democrat and Republican alike, said, Culvahouse, when you get out to Canberra, you need to make sure that the Quad is a real thing. That needs to be your priority. The India, Japan, Australia, the United States together can make a real difference. And I saluted and said yes. And so I get out to Canberra and I say, okay, let's get started on the Quad. And my staff looked at me and said, who's going to tell the Indians? And I said, what do you mean? And as it turned out, the Quad in the first decade of 2000 was active, but because of a change of government in Australia, the Kevin Rudd Labor regime decided to withdraw from the Malabar task force naval exercises, which greatly embarrassed the Indians. And of course, the fleet commander from Malabar at the time went on to be chief of Navy and then went on to be the Minister of Defense. So he was not interested in seeing the Quad occur again without the Australians doing further penance. Because of the border incursions by the PRC in the Himalayas, the Indians, I think, had finally decided to forgive the Australians. The Japanese have been good marriage brokers, and Australia was finally invited this year to rejoin Malabar, and did on a moment's notice. They had a ship poised and up in Darwin, ready to go, and it steamed at full speed and barely caught up with the convoy as it departed the Indian Ocean. But that's very important, and the Quad is especially important, Todd, because the Aussies have opened our eyes. The challenge is not only the Pacific, it's also the Indian Ocean, and that's the reason we're pretty disciplined about talking about an Indo-Pacific strategy. The Quad is also doing a lot more on the soft power side. As I was leaving, you had Quad finance ministerial meetings. You had Quad development ministerial meetings, as you did also on the Five Eyes side. So there's the Quad will be both soft power and hard power alliance, although it's informal. There's no formal agreements. There's no secretariat. It's basically something that is recreated every meeting.
Well, since we're on multilateral arrangements, I wonder if you could talk about Five Eyes, which is the intelligence consortium involving Australia, Canada, New Zealand, UK, and US. How well is that functioning?
I think it functions very well. Australia is the UK High Commissioner used to tease me. She said, you wouldn't say this if you were ambassador to London, but the Court of St. James. But I would say out loud that Australia is our most important Five Eyes partner. But it's because of us right now. It's because of Australia's geographic location with the PRC government being so active. But it's an alliance that has developed over time. And it's based on trust. It's based on trust in one another's technical hygiene and the technical security of our networks and of our human networks and of the counterintelligence regime. And it's and what we do is share raw intelligence. Most of the presumption is that our raw intelligence will be shared with the Five Eyes partners. So that's part of it. Another important part of it, and this is particularly important in Australia's case, is that we trust our Five Eyes partners to occupy lanes in the road so the United States does not have to occupy that lane in the road, to do collection in certain areas. And we have confidence that they will do it to our standards. And Australia occupies some important lanes in the road. And of course, we have some very sensitive joint defense facilities in Australia as well, which of course, if you fly into the city in which one of them is, the pilot will say, and if you look off to your left, you'll see the spy base, but it's in any event, this is a Virgin, or this is a Qantas pilot. I broke out laughing when I heard that, but anyway.
Well, okay. Ambassador Harris, thanks you for your great discussion and also for your discussion of the Quad. He says, can you speak to Australia-France defense ties, particularly regarding the agreement for France to build the Australian submarine force? And he says separately, what about the FPDA, the Five Power Defense Association?
Harry, thank you for the softball.
What are friends for?
Yeah, what are friends for? Harry will then correct me on all the things I've said wrong. By the way, the submarine contract is worrisome. and there's a lot of debate right now. The Australians decided they did not have the infrastructure to have nuclear powered submarines. So in and their Collins class submarines are antiquated or are going to become antiquated. So they contracted with the French to take a nuclear submarine design and convert it to a diesel electric. And it's behind and it's over budget, and it is and it has the prospect of gobbling up a huge percentage of Australia's increased defense spending. So that's the issue that we're all worried about. It is, and of course, you've got the defense minister taking a leave of absence, and this sits on the top of her desk. The chief of Navy, Mike Minnon's very capable, but the issue is going to be one that I'm sure is worrying Scott Morrison. The French are becoming more active in the region. You have French Polynesia. The French ambassador, Christophe Pinot, was recalled to Paris and has been rehatted as their ambassador to Indo-Pacific, advising Macron. So the French are investing a lot, but all of us are going to have to work to solve the submarine program. Scott Morrison, Harry's last question on multilateral institutions. Morrison is a real proponent, and he's an interesting guy and a far-sighted guy, but he thinks that multilateral institutions, we should invest in one, whether it's Five Eyes plus two, the two being Japan and France, or the G7 plus two, the two being Australia, and I forget the next one, or the Democracy 10. But he believes that we should use several of those to be the strategic foundations for multilateral cooperation, whether it's humanitarian assistance, economic development, particularly economic development, infrastructure development, and intelligence. So I'll defer to Harry on how well all of these are doing, but and I hope I haven't misspoken too much. I'll get a bad grade from him, I'm sure.
We'll check out the recording of Harry's recent talk, which is really fantastic.
Right.
And a question here from Ambassador Philip Hughes. What kind of relationship does Australia maintain with Taiwan? And can or would a Taiwan government ever consider Australia a source of even implicit support in the face of the PRC's pressures on Taiwan?
Very good question. The answer is I don't know the answer to any of those questions. But Australia has done, I think when I was there, at least 2 Taiwan Strait passages, and much to the dismay of the PRC, and that was one of the 14 grievances that the DCM Wang mentioned. But whether Australia would come to Taiwan's defense, I don't know. I do know that Australia has worked with us in fortifying some of the Pacific Island nations who still support Taiwan and still have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So Australia views the Taiwanese as part and parcel of the solution and pushing back against malign PRC activities in the region.
Thank you. You mentioned that you were talking in your discussion earlier about the fires and so forth in Australia and the flooding. Did the fires and flooding, this is a question from Don Bliss, did the fires and flooding this past year affect Australian policy on climate change?
Well, climate change is a tough one for the Australians. When Scott Morrison sat me down and walked me through how he was going to win the election, he had 4 seats in Queensland that were held by the Labor Party that he thought he would win because the Labor Party had mishandled the climate change issue. All four of these constituencies were constituencies that exported either liquefied natural gas or coal or both. And he felt that the Labor Party had leaned over too far on the Green side, saying that Australia is very concerned about, the people are very concerned about climate change. They're anti-nuclear. The cost of energy is very high. It's an oddity that way. It's a country that's awash in fossil fuels, and particularly in LNG, which has been a great one of the contributing factors in the United States has reduced our carbon footprint as we've converted coal-fired power plants to natural gas. But it is a very difficult one. I've been grateful and gratified to see thus far, and knock on wood, that the new administration has not pressed Morrison into a corner on climate change. And I think Morrison is like a duck whose feet underwater are paddling as fast as they can on trying to get to a better place on climate, but being a political realist. But just let me say, though, that Matthias Cormann, the former finance minister in the Morrison cabinet, was just elected Secretary General of the OECD. And he did it by taking a chart around to each and every member of the OECD and showing them that that Australia, notwithstanding the publicity, had done more than most members of the OECD in reducing its carbon footprint, notwithstanding its bad reputation on climate change. But at the same time, how are they? If they ceased exporting liquefied natural gas, if they ceased exporting coal, I don't think that's going to reduce the number of coal-fired power plants that will be built in China or be built in other places, and therein lies the challenge. I think Australia is but part of the frontier technologies that we agreed to develop together with the Chinese, with the Australians at the state visit are to basically reduce carbon emissions, carbon capture. There's a lot of opportunity for carbon capture in Australia.
AB, just during this discussion, there was a news flash that came up on my screen talking about the North Koreans testing a few missiles, which are going to test in turn the Biden administration. I was wondering what advice would the Australians have for the United States in dealing with North Korea? Have they been helpful?
Well, Australia has been part of the effort in monitoring activities in North Korea, as Harry Harris knows. They've also, their Navy has been active in enforcing the sanctions against North Korea, interdicting illicit trade. There's some of the joint defense facilities in that part of the world are part and parcel of what we use to monitor what's going on in Korea. So it's the Aussies are supportive, and I think have been consistently supportive of U.S. policy in Korea.
Great. You were telling me a couple months ago about some social media controversies that came up in Australia, I think involving Facebook. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, it's the Australians are a little bit behind us. Or maybe ahead of us, but in any, how can I say this? Many of the print press in the middle-sized cities in Australia still exist, are still vibrant, and are quite active. And both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party view those as an important part of their democracy. And they view the Facebook and Google not compensating those newspapers in the main and TV stations somewhat for their content to be undermining Australian democracy. Facebook and Google will say that's because most of those newspapers are owned either by Rupert Murdoch or another two other big chains, that they are being supported. But then you have on top of that the Australian white supremacists, there's no other way to describe them, who went to New Zealand, to Christchurch, New Zealand, and killed 50 people, more than 50 people in 2 different mosques. And he was live streaming those murders as he was doing it, which I think horrified the Australian government and created a bad environment. So it's been it was an issue that we dealt with. It was an issue we had to deal with carefully because News Corp had reincorporated the United States. So as far as the United States Embassy is concerned, the News Corp was a U.S. company, Facebook was a U.S. company, and Google was a U.S. company. So we were working very hard to try to see if there wasn't an accommodation. It's the Australian government is totally unafraid. Just like they're somewhat unafraid of China, but they're totally unafraid of being the regulator in this important area. And when the U.S. companies have talked about shutting down Australia and did for a few days, it just the reaction of the public and of the both parties has been support the government. So I think it's to be watched. Australia's not a huge country, but but again, a lot of the other countries in the region look to it for leadership and emulate what Australia does. And that's the advice that I would give to U.S. social media countries, that don't assume that you're talking about 4% of the world. Assume you're talking about potentially 30% of the world.
Right. Interesting. We're getting to the top of the hour. Let me conclude with a kind of generic question. What did you find most surprising when you got the post?
Interesting. One big issue, and every one of our members of Congress have by the day that he or she is elected, have a top secret security clearance, right? We have many people in the public who are now in the private sector who've had top secret security clearances. Many of them still have. There are very few members of the Australian government that have security clearances. None of the opposition. Anthony Albanese, who's the opposition leader of the Labour Party, he didn't have a security clearance. The shadow defense minister, shadow foreign minister, they don't have security clearances. So when you talk about the threat from whether it's this country or that country or what, you have to be really careful, and you cannot assume that they know what you know. And whereas in this country, I mean, you go up to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee or the House Armed Services Committee, and all 50 people in the room have a clearance. So that was the most surprising thing, Todd. And it limits discussion, and it's good for operational security, but it hinders diplomacy.
Interesting. Well, AB, it's clear to all of us that the United States is very well represented in Australia. We really appreciate your service. We appreciate your taking the time with us today, and appreciate your joining the council. And I think you can hear everyone. You may not be able to hear, but everyone's clapping out there for your presentation today. And I just want to thank you, and look forward to seeing you in future events.
My pleasure, Todd, and I can tell you're a diplomat. You're making a silk purse out of a sow's ear, but no, hopefully people can laugh at It's been my pleasure.
Kathleen, I don't know if you want to conclude by mentioning, or Jocelyn, by talking about some of the upcoming events and the dates and so forth. Feel free to do that now as we conclude.
Sure, this is Kathleen. So the next event that's going to be coming up on our schedule is going to be on Wednesday, April 7th, and that will be Ambassador Elena Marks, who recently returned from South Africa. And then after her, we have Ambassador Trevor Trino, who served in Austria on April 13th. And then April 20th, we have Ambassador Chris Landau, who served in Mexico. And then we just recently, I've just been in touch with Ambassador Abi Zaid, who came back from Saudi Arabia. He is going to hopefully on April 28th. So we have quite a lineup of former members of the Trump administration who have graciously agreed to speak to the council. So we're really pleased with that. It's fantastic.
Okay, well, thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Jocelyn, for helping us organize this. Thank you, Ambassador, again, for great discussion today. Really appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you all the next time.